One of the most famous lawmen in American history, the story of Wyatt Earp has endured for over a century. He's inspired movies, songs, and countless touristy reenactments. But who was the man behind the myth? Was he really as great as the stories make him seem? We've all heard about his legendary deeds, but there was a chilling darkness to this heroic figure. Dive into the violent history of Wyatt Earp, Tombstone's infamous marshal. Earp spent almost his entire life on the move, even from the very beginning. Not long after he was born, his father packed the family up and joined a caravan of people heading west to California. The state offered vast swaths of fertile farmland, and Nicholas hoped to give his family a fresh start. The Civil War broke out while the Earps were living in Pella, and three of Wyatt's brothers enlisted in the Union Army. Wyatt himself desperately wanted to join them, but he was only 13 years old. Still, he tried his best. Earp ran away from home several times to try and enlist, but each time his cantankerous father tracked him down and hauled him back home. Wyatt Earp almost never had the insane life that he lived. By the time he was 21, his family had moved to Lamar, Missouri, and while eking out an existence there, he met a beautiful young woman named Orilla Sutherland. The two fell for each other instantly, and they married within a year of their first meeting. Earp then bought a small plot of land, built a house for his new wife, and she soon became pregnant. This young family settled into what appeared to be a rather uneventful domestic life. But of course, as you know, that's not how Wyatt Earp's story goes. Urilla was about to give birth to the couple's first child when tragedy struck Earp's life. She contracted the deadly typhoid fever and passed within a matter of days. Suddenly, Wyatt Earp had everything he loved ripped away from him, and it changed him forever. After that day, he became cold and ruthless. Had his wife lived, the entire history of the Wild West would have been completely different, but apparently fate had other plans. As a young Wyatt Earp grew older, he fell in with a group of roughnecks and criminals. By his mid-20s, he found himself on the wrong side of the law more often than not. Eventually, the authorities caught up with him, and Earp was charged with horse theft. A U.S. Marshal apprehended him and threw him in jail to await trial, but Earp wasn't about to sit around and wait for his fate. Not long before his sentencing, Earp escaped from his cell and headed for Peoria, Illinois. But his troubles were far from over. Earp quickly became an infamous figure around Peoria, for all the wrong reasons. People around Peoria considered him to be bad news. He earned the nickname the Peoria Bummer, and the regular, law-abiding citizens of the town came to hate his guts. He was seen as the figurehead of a certain class of sleazy loafer who made an embarrassment of their otherwise respectable village. Little did they know, this no-good bum would go on to be one of the most famous lawmen in the history of the Wild West. Clearly, Earp wasn't about to win any Man of the Year awards in Peoria, so when he heard his brother James was running his own House of Ill Repute in Wichita, he saddled up and headed for Kansas toot sweet. Wichita was an important railroad terminal at the time, and a key stop for rangers driving up their cattle from Texas. The lawmen in town needed all the help they could get, and this is where Earp got his first taste of authority. After helping an off-duty police officer find a group of wagon thieves, Earp joined the marshal's office soon after. Suddenly, he had a respectable job and a steady paycheck. But still, life as a lawman was anything but simple. Earp inherited his father's wild temper and ended up costing him his job in Wichita. So, Earp did what he did best. He left town and went to join his brother James, who had set up yet another dingy boarding house in Dodge City. So Earp met up with him there and started all over again. Later, in 1876, an outlaw by the name of Dirty Dave Rudabaugh stole from the Santa Fe Railroad Company and fled south towards Texas. This was an important event in Earp's life for two reasons. First, the Dodge City Marshal's Office made Earp a temporary deputy U.S. Marshal and sent him off to catch Dirty Dave. Second, while on the hunt for the outlaw, Earp came across a notorious gambler who had played cards with Dirty Dave. That gambler's name was Doc Holliday, and their conversation was the start of Earp's most important and lasting friendship. When Wyatt Earp arrived in Dodge City, it was the epitome of a Wild West frontier town. But things could change very quickly back then. Within just a few years, the town had really begun to settle down, and a shoot first, ask questions later marshal like Earp suddenly found himself extremely out of place. It was right around that time that he received a letter from his brother Virgil, who had recently set up shop in a new boomtown over in Arizona territory. That's all Earp needed to hear. In 1879, he packed up his things and set off for the most infamous chapter of his life in the brand new mining town of Tombstone. Soon after he arrived in Tombstone, his brother Virgil, who was still a U.S. Marshal, hired him to help track down a group of cowboys who had stolen 6 mules from the army. The gang that stole the mules was known as the Cochise County Cowboys. The head of the gang, a man named Frank Patterson, agreed to bring the mules back to town the following day, but in reality, he had something very different in mind. The next day, the cowboys showed up in town completely empty-handed, just so that they could laugh in the faces of Virgil and Wyatt Earp. They didn't know it at the time, but they just made a fatal mistake. Not long after the mule fiasco, a group of cowboys got up to no good once again. In the middle of the night, 5 of the gang, led by the infamous Curly Bill Brocious, stumbled out of a saloon and started firing their revolvers at the moon. The town marshal, Fred White, came out of the woodwork to try and disarm the men, and it was the last thing he ever did. White grabbed the barrel of Brocious's revolver, but it went off, striking him in the groin. That's when Wyatt Earp, who had heard the shooting and come running, arrived on the scene. Earp took a more direct approach when it came to apprehending Brocious. He simply smashed the man over the head with the butt of his pistol. Fred White succumbed to his wounds not long after. However, in a strange twist, White and Brocious had been somewhat friendly, and in his final moments, White said that Brocious was innocent and should not be held accountable. But whatever White said, the people of Tombstone loved their marshal, and they were out for blood. Curly Bill Brocious was one of the worst Cochise County cowboys, but strangely enough, he had Wyatt Earp to thank for his life. For a time at least. As he sat in a Tombstone jail cell, the townsfolk cried for revenge, and he undoubtedly would have been lynched had he stayed there long. But thanks to White's call for mercy, Earp quickly had Brocious spirited away to nearby Tucson. Earp eventually rose to the rank of deputy sheriff in Tombstone, but it didn't last long. Wyatt Earp was many things, but politician wasn't one of them, and he ended up getting squeezed out for a man named Johnny Behan. Earp and Behan had already crossed paths in Tombstone and held no fond feelings for each other, but once Behan took over as sheriff, their bad blood got a whole lot worse. Tensions in Tombstone were reaching a fever pitch. They came to a head one night in 1881. Around midnight, Doc Holliday and Ike Clanton got into a wild argument in one of Tombstone's many saloons. Holliday called Ike a dirty liar. Ike took opposition to that. That's when Virgil was finally fed up with the antics. He ambushed Clanton and bashed him over the head with his pistol, the trademarked Earp move. He took away Clanton's revolver and hauled him down to the courthouse for a $25 fine. Okay, that doesn't sound like a lot, but there was more at play here than money. The Earps had crossed one of the most important Cochise County cowboys, and the notorious gang wasn't about to let that slide. While Ike was inside the courthouse getting his fine, Right out front, Wyatt Earp almost walked straight into Tom McLaury, one of the other Cochise County cowboys. The two men ended up nose to nose, and Earp asked the cowboy if he was armed. McLaury sneered that he was not, but Earp could clearly see a revolver in the man's waistband. Earp suddenly drew his own sidearm and, as he was wont to do, hit McLaury over the head with it. Shortly after, three more cowboys, Ike's brother Billy, Tom's brother Frank, and Billy Claiborne, finally showed up in town. Having 5 angry cowboys wandering the streets, at least 3 of whom were armed and dangerous, made Virgil Earp nervous. He decided to take it upon himself to remove their arms by force. He called upon his brothers Wyatt and Morgan, as well as Doc Holliday, and headed across the streets of Tombstone, towards the fated OK Corral. As the Earps strutted across Tombstone, they came across a frantic Sheriff Johnny Behan. According to Wyatt, Behan claimed that he had already disarmed the cowboys, which was a lie. Still, the Earps decided that they would go and check for themselves. The Earps finally confronted the cowboys, and it wasn't long before the shooting started. Nobody really knows who shot first, but most witnesses generally agreed that the first 2 shots happened at almost the exact same time. Clearly, both sides were itching for a fight. When the shooting stopped, Doc Holliday had a horrible bruise from a bullet that grazed his holster. Virgil Earp had been hit in the calf, and Morgan Earp had a wound in each of his shoulders. Only Wyatt remained unhurt. But while the Earps were injured, the cowboys fared much, much worse. Tom McLaury, Frank McLaury, and Billy Clanton all lay dead in the dust. As the wounded Earps stumbled away from the empty lot, they came across Johnny Behan once again. The flustered sheriff shouted, "I will have to arrest you!" Wyatt Earp slowed for a moment, turned, looked him in the eye, and simply stated, "You have deceived me. You told me these men were disarmed. I went to disarm them." That's kind of a mic drop moment. Ike Clanton did everything in his power to have the Earps and Holliday thrown in jail. In his defense, they did kill 3 men. The judge in the matter took sworn statements from over 30 witnesses. One of them was Wyatt's mortal enemy, Sheriff Behan, who, the weasel that he was, claimed that the cowboys had been completely innocent. He said that they had all thrown up their arms and turned out their coats to show that they were unarmed, but that the vicious Earps had opened fire anyway. It was a complete lie, but luckily for the Earps, there were plenty of other witnesses poking their heads through windows to see what happened that day. The judge eventually ruled that there wasn't enough evidence to indict the Earps and Doc Holliday, but that doesn't mean there weren't consequences for their actions. Not only had they gained the reputation of cold-blooded killers, but the rest of the cowboys weren't going to take the deaths of their friends sitting down. The gang started plotting their revenge, and they would have it before long. A few months after the OK Corral, Virgil Earp was suddenly ambushed on the streets of Tombstone. A shotgun blast hit him in the arm and shoulder, seriously maiming him. When Morgan Earp was playing billiards in a saloon, a group of gunmen shot him through the windows from the dark street. One of the bolts struck him in the spine, and he passed 40 minutes later. That's when Wyatt Earp finally snapped. On the day his brother Morgan drew his last breath, Wyatt Earp left law and order behind. He lost all faith in civil justice and set about avenging his brother himself. He gathered together a posse of 8 men and swore that he would have his revenge on the Cochise County Cowboys. It was the start of the infamous Earp Vendetta Ride, which would claim the lives of several more men before it was finished. The Earps chased the remaining cowboys out into the wilderness. Ironically, one of the men they chased was Curly Bill Brocious, the man whom Wyatt had saved from a lynching little over a year earlier. When the Earps finally caught up with them, yet another gunfight ensued. Curly Bill himself shot directly at Wyatt, but missed by a hair. Wyatt Earp, calm and cool as always, didn't even flinch. He returned fire, hitting Curly Bill in the chest from 50 feet away. After the gunfight that claimed the lives of Curly Bill and several other cowboys, the Earps were satisfied. But they had another problem on their hands. Remember, the Earp vendetta ride was completely outside of the law, and you can't just go around shooting people for the purpose of vengeance. Johnny Behan had assembled his own crew, and he was hot on their trail. Behan's posse got within eyeshot of the Earps, but never managed to close the gap. Though the Earps had been prepared to stand and fight, if it had come to that, Behan's men never actually found them. The Earps gave them the slip and managed to sneak out of Arizona into New Mexico. Eventually, Behan was forced to give up, and Wyatt Earp got away with his grim justice scot-free. The end of the Earp vendetta ride was the end of an era, in more ways than one. Not long after leaving Arizona, Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday had a falling out that led to the end of their friendship. They parted ways and only saw each other twice for the rest of their lives. The final time, just 5 years later, Earp's wife Josephine noticed that Holliday was a shell of his former self. He was a hollow skeleton of a man who coughed constantly and could barely hold himself upright.
For exclusive perks like early access to new videos, priority replies to your comments, and to have your say on future content, consider becoming a Factinate member. On top of that, your support helps keep the channel going. Click the link in the description for more details.
Johnny Behan and Wyatt Earp had at least one thing in common. They shared the same taste in women. When Behan arrived in Tombstone, he brought his wife with him, a working girl named Sadie Mansfield. Most people, however, would know her by a different name, Josephine Herp. It turns out Sadie found Behan in bed with another woman soon after she arrived in Tombstone, so she kicked him out. Not long after, townsfolk began to see Sadie spending a lot of time with one Wyatt Earp, who everyone already knew was Behan's biggest rival. Hey, if Earp couldn't have Behan's job, at least he could have Behan's woman. Following his adventures in the Wild West, Earp ended up in San Francisco with Sadie, who now went by Josephine Herp. They stayed common law partners for over 4 decades until Earp's death. Wyatt Earp spent his final days in Los Angeles, working as an unpaid film consultant in Hollywood and trying to get a movie about his life made. After a wild existence of gunfights and barroom brawls, he passed quietly of cystitis at 80 years old. He had outlived every single one of his siblings and left no children. By that time, he was one of the final relics of the Wild West, and the days of outlaws and gunslingers felt like a distant memory. If you enjoyed this Factinate video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. Want to say in who we cover next? Join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.